All Indiana Politics
is your premier source for Indiana politics.
Focusing on issues that matter to you.
I still want us to be the best in the Midwest.
We can't afford another lockdown.
Give the citizens of this country the relief they need.
Education in the state of Indiana remains priority number one.
In-depth, nonpartisan coverage.
We don't know exactly where the economy will be in January.
People are worried with good reason.
Exclusive interviews with Indiana's political leaders.
We have the resources here in the state of Indiana to care for those who are in need.
Expert analysis on critical legislation.
We need to reform those laws.
This recovery is going to take some time.
We've got to anticipate that there'll be a budget shortfall.
From Wish TV, this is All Indiana Politics Podcast on the All Indiana Podcast Network.
I'm Garrett Bergquist, government reporter for Wish TV and the producer of All Indiana Politics. The attempted assassination of former President Donald Trump threw a spotlight on America's harsh political rhetoric. I talked to Professor Steven Webster. He studies political polarization at IU. He tells me the attempt on Trump's life was an extreme symptom of a long-growing problem for which elected officials carry a large part of the blame. Let's bring in IU political science professor Steven Webster. Professor, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So as someone who studies political polarization, what are some things that stand out to you both about the attempt on former President Donald Trump's life and on the way that Americans are responding to it?
Yeah, I think what we saw last weekend was an extreme outcome of some of the trends that have been developing in American society. The reality is that Republicans and Democrats are quite divided. We have very few things in common with one another, and we increasingly think of ourselves primarily in terms of our partisan identity rather than our identity as an American or as a citizen. And so politics has become quite central to how we think of ourselves. And so it can lead to this worldview of it's us against them. And when you have these sorts of divisions in society, you have the possibility for something horrible happening like we saw at former President Trump's rally.
How would you rate how President Biden and former President Trump have handled this in the public statements they have made since the attempt?
You know, I think both men are trying their best to handle this. We saw Joe Biden give his Oval Office address saying that it's time to sort of turn down the temperature in American politics. And I think that was the right and the appropriate thing to say. Whether that's actually going to happen is, of course, another question. Donald Trump's immediate response to the shooting appeared to be a good step forward towards doing that. Thanking the first responders, expressing his condolences to the people who were injured and who lost their lives at the rally. So I think that's a good start, but I think we need to see that continue on rather than having both sides sort of fall back to their sort of partisan goals and their campaign objectives.
As of this recording, we don't yet know what the shooter's motives might have been. Given the political environment we are in, at some point, does it even matter what the shooter's motives were?
You know, it doesn't matter in the sense that it would change what happened. But I think it's worth noting in this context that by and large, Americans reject partisan violence. And any poll that we have measuring support for violence registers very, very low numbers. And so that's, quite encouraging. The problem is that there's a lot of anger in our politics. Democrats and Republicans are angry at one another. They mistrust one another. And we do have lots of sort of anger and fear-infused rhetoric coming from our politicians. And so while it's true that most Americans, an overwhelming number of Americans, do not support partisan violence, the sort of combative and hostile nature of our politics creates the opportunity for something like this to happen. And I think that is worrisome.
What can individual voters do to push back against this trend? And more importantly, what do politicians and political candidates need to do to push back against it?
So those are great questions. I think in terms of what voters can do, I think the first step is simply talking to someone whose political viewpoints are different than your own. By and large, Americans tend to misperceive members of the other party. They tend to think that members of the other party believe things that they don't actually believe. And so I think getting a better understanding of one another is the first step and an important step towards reducing these tensions. I think a lot of the blame lies with our elected officials here. Increasingly, elected officials appeal to voters' anger, and they do this because this is a useful campaign strategy for them. Quite simply, an angry voter is a loyal voter. So if you are angry at the opposing party and its candidates, you are likely to vote loyally for your own party's candidates. And so until this becomes not an incentive that our elected officials face, I think we're likely to see continued appeals to anger from our elected officials.
How would you advise people handle those conversations with someone who does not agree with them?
Yeah, I think anytime you have a discussion with somebody whose politics are different than your own, it's going to be difficult. I think the sort of initial instinct is to defend your own point of view, or perhaps poke holes in the other person's point of view. But I think approaching these discussions with empathy and with a sort of willingness to understand, or at least listen, is the first step. You may not have to agree with what somebody else thinks, but at least listening to them and having that conversation, I think, is a really important thing to do.
We saw how quickly the responses retreated to partisan corners after the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol. How much of a chance is there that this is going to be a genuine turning point versus simply turning into another point of partisanship?
I think we're already seeing signs that this is going to be yet another partisan issue. We've had Democrats and Republicans both point to heated rhetoric that the other side uses. There's been questions about what the Secret Service was or wasn't doing. And so I think the sad reality of contemporary American politics is that everything gets viewed through a partisan lens. And so as sad as something like a shooting of a former president is, I think this likely is just yet another example of partisan politics sort of rearing its ugly head in American society.
Is it time for fundamental structural changes to our electoral system in order to reduce the reward that anger provides?
Perhaps, but I think that would have to be something that would be really well thought out. We know that political institutions have a tremendous effect on political behavior. And so anytime you change the institution, you do change behavior. But without knowing what specific institution we could design, I think we need to be careful about sort of changing the way that we elect candidates. But I do think the sort of divisions in our society are so deep and so durable right now that I think we need to really think carefully about what can be done to alleviate some of these tensions.
I want to return to a point you made earlier. An angry voter is a loyal voter, particularly in a country where we have regular election cycles. How do you recommend politicians urge people to get out to vote without resorting to that kind of dialogue?
It would be nice if politicians could mobilize voters around an optimistic, forward-looking vision, what their plans are going to do for the country. But what we know is that the psychology of emotions suggests that negative emotions, so things like anger and anxiety, tend to motivate more than positive ones like enthusiasm or hope. And so given that sort of psychological basis of these emotions, I think it's really hard to encourage politicians to sort of appeal to our better angels.
Is this a new normal in American society?
I think the anger that we're seeing now is in some ways new. So perhaps we could call this a new normal. But I think we also need to recognize that anger has a long tradition in American politics. We've fought a civil war over our differences. We've had, early politicians shoot one another. We've had fistfights on the floor of Congress. And so anger is not particularly new in American politics. But what I think is new is our ability and the frequency with which we can become angry. We can pull out our cell phones and look at whatever social media platform or news outlet tells us what we want to hear. And so the degree to which we become angry and the frequency with which we become angry is new in American politics.
What advice can history offer from past periods where American society was very, very deeply divided, but later came back together, if only for a while?
I think if you look at American history or history of other countries throughout the world, when you have societal divisions that are as deep as ours are, That's not a good thing. You need to have some sort of common identity or some unifying theme that can bring people together in spite of their political differences. And so I think anything we can do to encourage people to think of themselves as citizens or as Americans rather than as Democrats or Republicans is quite important. The problem is it's not obvious what that thing is. Traditionally, sort of foreign threats have brought Americans together. So if you think about the Cold War, Democrats and Republicans could, to some degree, put their political differences aside because there was a larger threat of the Soviet Union. But we don't really have something analogous to that now, nor would we probably want to have something like that. But if we could find some sort of positive unifying thing that affects all Americans, I think that would help sort of reduce the tensions that we see in our society.
Professor Steven Webster is a political science professor at IU. He specializes in political polarization. Thank you for talking to us.
Thanks for having me.
That was Professor Steven Webster. He studies political polarization at IU. Remember, you can catch All Indiana Politics every Sunday morning at 9:30 exclusively on Wish TV. I'm Garrett Bergquist. Thanks for listening.
From Wish TV, this is All Indiana Politics Podcast on the All Indiana Podcast Network. Watch All Indiana Politics live Sunday mornings at 9:30 on Wish TV and at wishtv.com. Subscribe to this podcast and listen weekly here on the All Indiana Podcast Network. And be sure to discover even more great podcasts at allindianapodcastnetwork.com.